This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm taking a look at Diamine Oxford Blue. I'll be testing it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib, and I'm going to begin with the Extra Fine. This is a Pilot 78G steel nib. This is nice. There's the feedback you would expect from a nib this fine, but it's not scratchy at all, and by extra fine nib standards it's pretty smooth, so I'm gonna say that this is nice. Very usable and very legible, the line it puts down. Next I have a Pilot Pereira with a fine nib. This is very smooth. And normally I just say, and actually I noticed this on some of my other writing samples, my extra fine looks like it's wetter than the fine. That's kind of surprising. Now normally I would just say that this fine nib writes nice, but this is actually very smooth. Next, I've got my Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. This is very smooth. A little bit, I would actually prefer a little bit of feedback. Look how wet that is. Just to give me a little more control. I feel like I write a little more, a little neater if I have just the tiny bit of friction between the nib and the paper. But that was very smooth. Alright, next I have a Kaweco Perkeo all black with a medium nib. Now, this is not quite as smooth as the Custom 74 was. Very comfortable to write with, but just my own personal preference, when I have an ink this dark, I prefer the finer line. So we're getting into wider lines that the medium, I'm just not as crazy about the way that looks, but it wrote really well. Next I've got my Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. Now, even though the line width is similar to the line width of the Perkeo, even maybe the downstrokes are a little bit wider, the crispness of it, I don't know, I just kind of like the way that looks. And it was, again, very smooth, very pleasant to write with. Next, I have the Nimicine Singularity with a 0.6 stub nib. Very smooth. I can tell this is putting down a lot of ink. Yeah. I prefer the 2 stub nibs over the medium, just the way it looks. But to be honest, I prefer the 2 fine nibs. Those are my favorite so far. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. Make sure this is in focus. All right. And while we let that dry, I'm going to take a look at some writing samples on a few other papers that I like to use. I've got my ARC notebook paper, and it didn't soak into the paper too badly. So let's see, it's not looking like it's wanting to feather too bad. I did notice it on the wider nibs wanting to spread. So even on the Custom 74, it puts down more ink, you see, than the steel fine nib. So the extra fine and the fine nibs were my favorite. And the fine nib was a nice balance of fine line and smooth writing. It was my favorite. The Custom 74 tends to put out, some spots the ink looks blobby and some spots it looks thin. So I prefer the fine steel nib on poor quality paper. On my Rhodia paper, everything was nice. Everything was very smooth. Again, just the medium nib, that's a bit too bold for me for ink this dark. I was seeing a little bit of shading with the Metropolitan. That was nice. The ink looked a little more navy instead of blue-black. And just very nice to write with. On my 20-pound copy paper, the ink just soaked in really quickly. The finer nibs I marked as nice. Again, the Custom 74 was putting down a little bit too much ink. It just looks a little blobby in some spots. In the broader nibs, the ink wanted to spread out. But as far as bleeding through, it did better than the Aurora green, which was kind of a surprise. Let's see, it wanted to come through a little bit. The fine and the extra fine, actually, since my fine nib writes a little bit drier than the extra fine, the fine nib did really well. The extra fine bled through in a few spots. Even my cursive medium, it's a little bit wetter than the cursive medium was on my old Pereira. It bled through in just a few spots. So in a fine nib, this is Oxford Blue is a good ink to use on poor quality paper. In my Leuchtturm, I do these writing tests by dipping the pen, so you can tell right here I had dipped it. And this is such a good flowy ink that in a broad wet nib like this, it really flowed out, and you can tell there was less ink just by the time I got down to here. That's kind of unusual. Usually for most of my writing samples, they're pretty uniform, but you can tell there's less ink here at the end, and especially on that ink smear. So it would probably perform differently than that if I actually had ink in a converter. And finally, on my Tomoe River paper, let's see, my lighting's kind of weird today. It's cloudy outside. I've got on the wetter nibs here from the medium down to the 1.5 stub. I've got an occasional halo of red sheen. And on my fine nibs, those are my favorite. This is just a nice pen for working and taking notes in a fine nib pen. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.